of the Maxeke-Robinson Chair offers both societies the unprecedented opportunity to think beyond histories of partition and apartheid, to build new imaginations of a post-partition world, at a moment that the future itself seems to slowly fade. It is fitting that we set this conversation at the waterfront and draw inspiration from the sea and from the work of Heaney's The Cure at Troy, dedicated to Nelson Mandela, to think with that further shore, as he says, where hope and history rhyme. Narrowing our trans-hemispheric connections, the Maxeke-Robinson Chair encourages a process of thinking of a common shared future beyond the horizons of nationalism and the administration of race and difference to overcome our troubled pasts. We explore, moreover, the crucial roles that the arts assume in bringing aesthetics and thought across disciplines and into the public sphere. It is thus fitting that this conversation takes place here at the Zeitz, a space that shares with us this commitment with art as world-making. The current exhibition, Past is Quiet, that I invite you to see, surfaces a counter-history of art museums without walls and museums that were in exile. We are engaged artists and initiatives and their political impetus that connects artist collectives across the globe. It is in the spirit of this exhibition that UWC and the Zeitz have established since 2021 a formal partnership, the Pan-African Museum Fellowship Postgraduate Program. This program prepares a new generation of museum professionals, curators, and educators to take on the task of engaging cultural publics and the arts in different spaces and platforms. It is here in this special place, from the vantage point of Museums of Solidarity, that we place our conversation today. It is in the wake of this complex and intersecting networks in which artists transformed international anti-imperialist movements of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, in which new imagined global futures were forged in opposing the Vietnam War, rejecting dictatorships in Latin America, where I'm from, boycotting the apartheid regime, and in support of the Palestinian struggle. In the wake of futures we have abandoned, and in place of those we are yet to engender, we find ourselves mobilizing these archives of solidarity today. As we reflect on the interconnected futures from Ireland to South Africa, we invite you to join us in a dialogue across generational divides. Young voices, emerging artists, and scholars offer fresh perspectives and urgency in imagining sustainable and inclusive futures, and by doing so, become catalysts for change and imagination. We invite collaborative efforts to imagine a shared, common, non-partition world. After our conversation, the Embassy of Ireland generously welcomed us to a reception. So we invite you to stay, to participate, moreover, to listen to our wonderful guests and their contributions. Thank you for being here. So without further ado, it is my honor to welcome the Irish Minister of Housing, Mr. Darragh O'Brien, who will share a few words of welcome before we commence. Thank you.
I have a very loud voice. I don't know whether, do I need a microphone? Yeah. Well, you're recording, so I will. So sorry, where do you want me to stand? I don't need blocking you out. I don't. It's okay. Okay, well, listen, Dave Galair, and hello everybody, and Carolina Boston, Curracan, and you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you here today. And Dr. Fernanda, thank you so much for your warm welcome and for your kind words. And I'm really delighted to participate in this gathering this afternoon. In this absolutely magnificent venue. I passed by it yesterday evening, haven't been inside it, and it really is a fantastic, breathtaking venue that we have here this evening. And I really hope that we'll have a very interesting conversation. I'm sure with our panellists here, I have absolutely no doubt that we will. I'm particularly pleased, if I could say, that we are hosted today by our great friends from the University of the Western Cape. And Ireland has a very close relationship with the university, which houses the archives of the Irish anti-apartheid movement. And if I just digress briefly, I had the real honour yesterday of visiting Robben Island, and had the honour of being brought around Robben Island by 3 former political prisoners who were there. From 1976 to 1991, those 3 gentlemen were imprisoned and incarcerated for fighting for freedom and for fighting for equal rights. And what really struck me from the discussions that I had with them as we walked around that hollow ground was that the in-depth knowledge that they had of small victories during the course of the struggle in other small countries like ours in Ireland. And one example being the very brave and determined women of the Dunnes Stores workers who decided that they would not carry out the job of distributing and displaying fruit and in particular from the apartheid regime in one of our largest multiples. And that gained a lot of prominence back in Ireland. And I remember that as quite a young child, I would say, but probably a young teenager at the time, if the truth be known. But interestingly, that from talking to Derek yesterday, that he actually remembers that when word filtered back to the prisoners there, no less so than the great Nelson Mandela himself, that this was something that really gave them a boost. And sometimes in Ireland we don't realise that some of the really principles, positions that we have taken over the years actually do make a difference. Sometimes we don't realise, as a small country in the western edge of Europe, that what we do matters. And that is very relevant in the current situation that our world finds itself in right now, and I might discuss that very briefly later on. But it really was the Irish anti-apartheid movement, I think, within Europe actually led at that time, and I'm very proud of those women and those men at the time who really stood up for their principles and supporting our sisters and our brothers here in South Africa in fighting against the absolute tyranny that was apartheid. And last year, and you referenced that my good friend and colleague, the Minister for State, Anne Rabbitte, launched the Maxeke-Robinson Chair in Irish Studies at UWC. And the chair is named after 2 icons of social justice. And the ambition is to promote a greater understanding of Irish history, of culture and literature here in South Africa, and very importantly as well, for us in Ireland to understand as well through that collaboration of the impact that South African literature, South African people have had on our own country and our own republic that's just over, well, our republic isn't, but just over 100 years since independence. So we're a little bit further down the road than South Africa, but we do understand. I think as a people, we feel a great affinity here with people who were oppressed as a country within Europe, who was really the only country that was colonised and didn't colonise anyone else. And we understand over 700-800 years of struggle what it means to have freedom and democracy, and that we need to value that so greatly and never, ever, ever take it for granted. And we see in our present world right now, where countries that we would have seen as stable democracies, when you look from the outside in, are no longer stable democracies. So we must cherish and value what we have as a people here in South Africa and indeed in Ireland. And I had the pleasure actually, former President Mary Robinson I've met on a number of occasions. She served in the Senate where I was Leader of the Opposition, and I had the pleasure of inviting her in where she recounted as a former Senator and a former President the work that she has done in human rights right the way across the world. And South Africa was a common thread right the way through those discussions in the Irish Senate. And this resource that we have here, the Maxeke-Robinson Chair of Irish Studies, has already proven to be an invaluable resource in bringing our countries closer together and to foster the sharing of knowledge and expertise. So it's so fitting that we're partnering here again this afternoon in this wonderful venue. And I want to pay particular tribute, if I may, to the Director of the Centre for Humanities and Research, Professor Heidi Grunehan. And Heidi, thanks so much for welcoming me here today as well. And to Pramesh Lalu for their sterling work over the past
last year in animating the chair. And I know that the embassy and our ambassador, our ambassador Austin Gormley is here today, really greatly appreciates the strong relationship with you. For the last 10 years, Ireland has engaged, as you may know, in a very significant historical reflection and debate, which marked the decade of centenaries, as we called it in Ireland. So looking back at those centenaries of struggle for independence, of a new democracy getting up and running, of valuing that democracy and making sure that there was a transition between governments as well. That was actually difficult in some respects, to strike the right balance. And even 100 years on, reconciliation, and I would say the reconciliation in Ireland in the main, there's still work to be done. But even when you look at things that happened 100 years ago, and I can speak with personal experience in my own family, and branches of families that may have been on different sides, even though the current generation were obviously not alive then, that it still can actually have an impact through people's attitudes and people's preconceived ideas of others. So that decade of centenaries really allowed us to have not just commemorations and national events, which in themselves are important, certainly for our citizens in a republic to reflect, but to allow really important discussions like this, where people can actually understand better positions, and maybe with the benefit of hindsight then, not to revise or to necessarily get involved in revisionism from one side, but to provide balance, and to provide balance within the Irish context as well. But also to move towards that reconciliation, in which we've seen in very recent times the work that we still need to do in the north of Ireland. And I'm very pleased as a senior government minister now that we have an assembly and an executive back up and running in the north of Ireland, and that people's democratic will is being vindicated within the assembly in the north of Ireland, and the great work that we can do both in the Republic and the north in cooperating together on real issues that matter to our citizens. We can all have a flag and we can all have a position, but at the end of the day, my clear view as someone who's been in politics since 2004 is that our job as a society, but my job as a politician, is to endeavour, one, to do my best and to work hard on behalf of those of our citizens, but to make sure that our country and our work in a better country and a better society than the one that we found at the time. And that's something that I'm sure all of us absolutely agree that we need to do. And as a major journey over the last decade, 2 decades, but the last decade in particular, particularly around women's health, around marriage equality, all of these very important things that, whilst our citizens have voted for them to be vindicated and laws to be changed, it's about bringing the people who may not have agreed with those positions, which I certainly did and advocated for, is that how we can actually, with that vote and those changes that have happened, how do we vindicate that and make that real on the ground for people, to make sure that our republic, like your republic, is one that's equal and that is blind to gender, that is blind to race, that is blind to ethnicity, blind to religion. And that's what we need to ensure that it is, that everyone in a republic should be equal. And that's what we value, and we value those principles, and we hold them greatly. But we've always got to continue to strive to make sure that that is something that we actually do. And we want to approach the question about our future through the eyes of young people, both at home and overseas, how people view us overseas, what things that we can do. And my engagements over the course of this week in Cape Town, and I was saying to Heidi that being so taken with Cape Town I might not leave, so I might look at doing some administrative work for Heidi in the background here to see if we can drive this program on further. But it's really, you know, particularly with our friends overseas, like here in South Africa, our diaspora, and they'll be the architects and indeed the custodians of our future. And you know, that future for all of us is incredibly important. That's why I'm so pleased that we're joined by 4 remarkable young people this afternoon. And I can say that because I'm old now, so I can say that. So take the compliments and accept it this afternoon to help us to imagine the shared future together for Ireland and for South Africa. And whilst our 2 countries are very different in many ways, we're all invested in the democratic dialogue. But in the few short days that I've been here, the attitude and the nature of our friends in South Africa is very, very similar. Our outlook as people is very, very similar. We get on well together. I've seen that. We're sociable people. We like to talk, as you guys all know now. and we do like to talk, and that's good because like people like people. And for all the policy that we have and all the incredible research that we do, without that human interaction, I'm not saying that's all lost, but it is not. We can't vindicate that. It's not as wealthy as it could be, and that's where these personal discussions are really important. My last two very brief reflections would be in 1990, when I was 16, so that I remember really, really clearly the Nelson Mandela, who wasn't yet president, who's just recently been released from incarceration, coming to Dublin. And coming to Dublin and coming to Dawson Street, to the Mansion House, to receive the freedom of the city of Dublin. And I remember as a 16-year-old there, like really thinking to myself that this was such a special day. Even I knew as a kid, I knew this was, for me, something that I would never, ever, ever forget. And I haven't since. And it had and continues to have a real impact. And what I was struck by President Mandela that time, and by many of his colleagues who have been giants in this world, the impact they still have, even though they have passed on. And that, let's remember, you know, what they did, what they sacrificed, you know, and never forget that either, that we'll always have more work to do. Things are never, unfortunately, ever going to be perfect. And one thing a poetry teacher, Brian taught me years ago, reading the poem Sailing to Byzantium, what that was really about is that you may never actually get there, because Byzantium is perfect, and we're never going to get to perfection. But like, they're the type of things that we really need to strive together to work with. Mandela said, and I'll leave it with this because I don't think there's any better way to say it, and then I'll pass you on to our fantastic panel here. And he said that sometimes it falls upon a generation to be great, and it does. But without wishing to put too much pressure on you guys here and our guest speakers, his next line was, "You can be that great generation and let your greatness blossom." And that's what I would say to you. And this, the work that you are doing is invaluable to further that understanding that we have and that friendship that we have between our two nations, and most importantly between our two people. So I'm so grateful for the invitation to be with you here today, and I'm so looking forward to hear your own reflections. So thank you very much indeed.
We are the five. Okay. You don't need to say if you can find it. Nice. Thank you so much, Mr. Brand. This is wonderful. And I have this amazing luck to be sitting here and to moderate this panel. We are going to talk about imagined futures from Ireland to South Africa, and to think together about the work of the youth and the young voices participating and producing and transforming this idea of the future and the future itself. So I'm going to introduce our guest today. Maxeke-Mary is the chairperson of the Kader Asmal Alumni Network, a community of talented young leaders who study their masters in Ireland through the Kader Asmal Fellowship Program. She has a master's in peace building and development from the University of Limerick in Ireland. She currently works as a researcher at the Institute for Security Studies in their Justice and Violence Prevention Program, where she coordinates the Western Cape Violence Prevention Forum. She's passionate about human development and building communities, and she firmly believes that economics is about people first before GDP. Here we have a colleague, friend, Dr. Lourdes Scott is a research fellow at the CHR, an interdisciplinary scholar with a focus on gender and sexuality in post-apartheid South Africa, He has written on the intersections of sexuality, gender, and African cultural practices in the post-colonial and post-apartheid moment. Luanda is interested in expansive ideas and practices of freedom that go beyond normative, nationalist, and racialized boundaries. Luanda's work echoes the call issued by Famida Riaz and her epic poem, and I quote, "Come, let us create a new lexicon." Adam McQueen is a theatre director, filmmaker, writer from the north of Ireland. Growing up in a divided society where culture could mean danger has infused an intrigue about the impact art can have. Trained in drama and physical theatre, much of his training came from 10 years as a co-founder and assistant director of Barefoot Theatre in Zambia, where he was exposed to the power of popular theatre to mobilize large audiences and democratize theatre, and be used as a weapon to directly support social change through dynamic shared experiences. He co-creates immersive experiences, makes films, writes scripts that blends politics and popular theatre ingredients, elevating unheard voices and allowing audiences and readers to have fun, directly engage and connect. He's passionate about working with actors and non-actors to unlock creativity and let our stories flow. Work is more often found outside the theatres, in the streets, hospitals, swimming pools, community spaces, or more recently, the UK Houses of Parliament.
But the most important thing to know is that today I was called young.
That's
all you need to know.
Listen, let's just accept that condition today. We just accept that. Colleague Linda Kushler-Manjali, PhD candidate, associate lecturer in the Political Studies Department at UWC. His research interests are broadly political theory, philosophy, with particular suspicion of South African democratic constitutional state. He is also particularly invested in contributing to a concrete, plausible critique of global capitalist hegemony and its attendant social ills. He identifies with and strongly supports the call to free Palestine from the river to the sea. Okay. So, okay, that's my question. So the way in which we plan this is a conversation. We have some questions to guide you, but you're going to guide this conversation wherever you want to go, mindful of the time, and Hayley reminded me. But we all want to hear from you. How do you see, it's a strong question, but how do you see young people and their contributions to reimagining, shaping the future, and how can we imagine this from Ireland to South Africa in this rapidly changing world, but also in relation to the work that you already do, the fantastic work that you already do. So, if you want to take us there.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. I see that we are all kind of disclosing our age. So I will begin with that. Thank you for the beautiful introduction, and thank you to the chair for the invitation. So I was born in 1995, which is at the dawn of democracy, which means I have lived through all the stages of South Africa's transition. And I come into this conversation, I guess, from my role as the chair of the Kada Asmal Alumni Network and as a researcher working on issues of development and violence, but also just personally as a citizen who had so much hope and grew up in a family that really had so much hope about the future of this country, and is kind of stuck in a, oh my gosh, what is happening stage. And I think I'll speak a little bit about who we are as a network and then respond to the question. So the Kada Asmal Alumni Network is a community of over 120 young leaders who are recipients of the Kada Asmal Fellowship, as it was said in the introduction. And they got the scholarship to go and study a master's in Ireland, different countries around Ireland. And when they come back, we are sort of the support network as the alumni. And the fellowship started in 2013, so it's now 10 years. Last year we were celebrating a decade of the fellowship. And after 10 years, I think it's that time where we kind of sit back and reflect and go, okay, what is happening, what are we doing? And we had our big reflection last year. And we started to see during that reflection that, this fellowship is contributing to social change. And it's doing it in a number of ways, which I've noted down. So the first way in which the scholarship is contributing to social change is that many of the fellows go on to be entrepreneurs and leaders in society. So we have fellows that are now running agricultural businesses in Limpopo, contributing to addressing challenges of food security and unemployment in South Africa. We have fellows that have taken up leadership positions in the UN, even in my capacity as a researcher and a coordinator of a provincial forum. I'm playing a leadership role in guiding conversations and debate around issues of violence in South Africa. The second way that we are seeing fellows having an impact, which links to your question of how are young people contributing to reimagining this future, is that we're seeing a lot of fellows deciding to stay in Ireland. And this is not unique to the fellows. I think I speak for most people when I say migration in Ireland has grown a lot. When I remember my time studying in Ireland, I was so surprised to find an African restaurant, saloon, it felt like you were in just another part of the world that had many pockets of all over. So our fellows have also decided to make Ireland their home, and in Ireland, they again in leadership positions in the tech sector, leading on conversations around migration and refugees. And I think in this change and in these roles that the fellows are playing, I've divided what young people are doing in general in three parts. So I think young people are leaders in innovation. And this is not surprising because we have grown up in such a different world. If you look at the changes that have happened with the internet and social media, it's estimated that 25 million South Africans have access to social media. Massive community. And young people are active and they contribute to driving the conversations in these platforms and to coming up with solutions that fits this context that we are part of. Young people are reimagining and redefining what activism means. And I think my fellow panelists will speak more about that. I don't want to go so deep into activism, but we see it in how our fellows are sort of engaging on political issues within the fellowship itself, but also in through social media, in the spaces that they're in. Different form of activism, definitely one that is unapologetic and is demanding accountability. And lastly, I think young people are part of driving a new normal. I think the world is moving towards what is considered as a good work environment, good health, is changing. And it's because young people are demanding that change, right? It's no longer about, hey, I'm getting a great salary. It's how does this work environment affect my mental health? Young people are driving a new normal in terms of identity. They're driving a new normal in terms of what is considered a good quality of life. And in all these three aspects, leading an innovation, reimagining activism, and driving a new normal, we see fellows playing such a critical role in that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. We're going to go back to some of these points. I like the idea of the new normal. We'll talk about that. But first, we hear from London.
Okay.
How do you understand
Me.
that question?
How do I understand your question? Maybe I'll start with, I'll circle back. And hopefully in the way I speak it will come back. It was interesting that the minister spoke about the Ireland and Irish people and the gift of the gap, as it were. I suppose and the affinity about that with South Africa and South African. And I guess at the bottom of that, right, is the idea of storytelling, right? It's the idea of folklore and you know, and of course this is an important form, it's an important aspect of Irish culture and Irish life, and which, as you rightly pointed out, also exists here, right, in terms of telling stories, and I think that's great. So, and then you mentioned something else that I think I want to pick up on, and which is the equality, marriage equality. And of course, one of the most unique things about, well, unique, but amazing things about it is exactly that it was gotten through the vote, right? Which is something that, which is the opposite in South Africa, right? Marriage equality in South Africa is achieved through the courts, right? And in fact, we know that it wouldn't be achieved through the ballot. But further from that, it is the work, right, that went into galvanizing people to actually agree that, and the scholarship around this is actually quite important in terms of thinking about mobilization and such. And so I wanted to kind of place those out there before I kind of think about this question, which I don't know if I know how to answer, but I think when you were talking now about post 94 life and young people, I immediately thought about once the quote unquote freedom was achieved or on the horizon, the kinds of creativity that post-94 moment allowed, we still kind of haven't really delved into, for example, for like quieter music, right? We can start and think about the kinds of happenings in urban culture post-1994 in terms of realizing freedom, right? Practices of freedom in that post-94 moment. There is a lovely edited collection about particularly quiet. I don't know why I thought about quiet particularly. I'm moving way away from script, but because of what you said, about being born at that particular time. But I think South Africa is not perfect, right, in the post-1994, in the past 30 years. But in that imperfection, I think a lot gets lost in terms of the vibrancy that has happened in this country in the past 30 years, in terms of practices of freedom. And young people have been the driver of that. And so, so I guess maybe perhaps what I was also picking up on with marriage equality is activism work and the lay of the land. I, of course, when I think about activism, I'm primarily in, thinking about, when working in or thinking with, gender movements, queer movements, and the kinds of ways in which, of course, they mesh and speak to each other. And the activism around those is vibrant, right? Considering the state of things. And again, young people, right, being at the fore of that. I could list the number of organizations that young people are driving to kind of push politics, and in fact, the kinds of legislations that we have, right, that are amazing, that have come post-1994, which, while we can admit that they exist on paper only in many respects, right, but those legislations have been driven by activism through NGOs and such spaces. And so just to echo just a little bit what you were saying. And maybe I should stop there and then we can talk about it.
Thank you. It's interesting that you both marked the post-apartheid moment together with the interview, and we talk about practices of freedom as well, perhaps through popular theatre. Adam, do you want?
Yeah, as you said, I grew up in the north of Ireland, but a lot of my work has been with young people in Zambia, where I worked for 10 years with a youth organisation. But yeah, in the north of Ireland, has anybody been to Ballymoney? Not yet. Good answer, maybe, yes. I think you would remember if you had been. I love the word imagine. I think that's really, really captivating. And surely as artists, that's what artists do, they paint a picture. So I love this word whenever I got sent this document. I love what you said about storytelling as well, and I love what you said as well about the two cultures. I really feel that. Two cultures who at their core are storytellers. And yes, a lot of that is because of adversity, but I think that's something that I really, really recognise, and I think it's very powerful. The other kind of phrase in the question was about a rapidly changing world, and I feel really anxious about this. I do feel, I know this term human security was first coined in, I think, 1994 by UNDP, but actually I feel really anxious about what's happening in the world at the minute. We've got wars in Europe, we've got wars in the Middle East, we've got challenges in West Africa. I just come from Zambia, where there's drought at the moment, so there is real food insecurity at the moment. It's a really perilous time, that's before we really go into talking about climate. And linked with this statistic that in 2030, the population of sub-Saharan Africa is going to be 42% young people. I think these two things converging at the same time is interesting, and I think there's a huge opportunity with that as well. What are young people doing? Young people are doing a lot, but I think there's massive scope for young people to do more. I'm glad I didn't get booed. I'm just testing to see if you were booers. Irish young people are doing a lot, and there's lots of ways to engage for Irish young people. Currently, at the minute, we've got one young person who's in New York at the Commission on the Status of Women. There's a delegation who are already in consultation about the UN future at the summit. There's an amazing organisation called NYCI, it's an amazing organisation which is the umbrella for youth organisations in Ireland. There's lots happening, and I think having a seat at the table is really important. Being heard, being listened to is vital, and especially at this point where integration and collaboration are more important than ever. But I feel, I suppose, conversations are moving very quickly at a certain pace and at a certain level. And what I think really is a plea from me is that some of these conversations are not held in ivory towers, and some of these conversations can actually be utilised in a two-way conversation on a more grassroots level, which I think is really interesting. I moved to the UK in 2016, which was the year of Brexit. So I didn't get a chance to register because I had just moved there. So I personally have always felt it was my fault because I hadn't registered. But one of the things from being there in 2016 was so clear was the messaging. It was so clear that people were not being communicated to in a way that was reflective of the conversations that were had on different levels. I feel as artists, that is our job, that is our role. I couldn't believe that this wasn't happening. And I think it's such an opportunity for young people and for artists to take the initiative with these conversations and to create dialogue and to use our weapon to open up conversations. Maybe the last thing I'll say on this is Ireland are actually doing something really, really inspiring with this bursary for the arts. It's absolutely amazing. 2,000 people are getting an income every week. It's a pilot for 3 years. I think it's 3 years, at which point it'll be evaluated. This is such an important part of democratizing this space and allowing artists to be free to engage with conversations that are affecting society
without all the trials and tribulations. And as a poor struggling artist, I can go into detail with that, but maybe I'll leave that for the reception. But I think that's a really, really interesting initiative that really deserves credit and is interesting just to bring to the panel. I'll leave that there.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. I'm a struggling artist, a struggling emerging academic. keep the lines flowing. They say they don't pay us in the academy, they thank us. On the 23rd, I'm thanked everyone. Yeah, I think another benefit of speaking last is that people do the groundwork and the very important work before you. And I'm going to come with a lot of abstract assumptions that I have about, first of all, this very powerful notion of imagining. Imagination and speaking to the very idea that it's not a neutral undertaking. That people think that you can let your imagination run wild, but sometimes people's social and structural circumstances do constrain how they can imagine. That they can't imagine themselves outside, of the strictures of society or the strictures of power, that hold them. So I think to be invited to a conversation around imagination is first a very radical step, and it's something that I appreciate truly. And I think as Adam, he spoke about introducing. I think Uzenzile spoke about her age. My age disclaimer is that Professor Pramesh Lal taught me first historical studies. So that's probably more disclaimer around his age. So yeah, enjoyed those classes, and I think a big part of speaking of that particular journey, the classes with Professor Lal and Professor Leslie Zeitz debating in a class, and we used to find it very difficult to deal with in the first 3 weeks. That these two gentlemen used to take each other on harshly for a good 45-minute period, and then laugh outside and walk outside the class and walk back to the historical studies department. And we couldn't understand that, particularly because we thought disagreement did not mean fidelity. We thought critique doesn't mean fidelity. We thought that when you disagree with people, you actually fight with them. But I think a big part of what I learned, and a big part of what I think young people are doing, like Adam said, I also want to say, notwithstanding the great work that's being done, there's a lot more that can be done. But I think the greatest thing that I think is happening, reflected in the 2015, hashtag growth, the soul movements and things that emanated from there, is that a lot of what young people are doing is questioning, maybe in unstructured ways, maybe in ways that aren't really refined, and that's part of it, isn't it? That's part of the intellectual, project, to be able to find, to move from confusion to clarity. And I think a lot of young people recognize that they are confused, right? And that, it's a beautiful place to be. Some people don't even know that they are confused. So I think there's a big part about what is happening, particularly in the South African case, is that young people recognize that something's not clicking, something's not right. And part of that is then raising this question around asking these particular questions. And I think the imagining that must still happen is an imagination against the grain, against dominant narratives, around this is what South Africa should be, and this is what, the island should be, or imagining something that can give us possibility, because there's a big idea that we've reached the end of history, and the young mustn't murder me. But this idea that we've reached the end of history, there's nothing better than what we have right now. And that all we need to do is improve the little bits and pieces of things that are going wrong. But I do firmly believe that young people aren't convinced of it. And I don't think it's only young people, I think their parents as well don't believe that we've reached the best, because they still see this whole notion of possibility. Minister, just another thing, that we are talkative, but we're also a very disagreeable bunch. So that's something we have in common, because I follow football, and Roy Keane is my guy that I really love. Very disagreeable, and I think is a metaphor for South African society. Very disagreeable bunch, but sometimes our disagreement isn't organized well enough to be registered as something that can be seen and translated into change that we all want to see. So sometimes we speak in corners, and we're not coordinated enough to do that disagreement. So I think a big part of the work that young people are doing, and that they must continue to do, is that they must continue to question. continue to be dissatisfied, continue to, they have an insatiable appetite for transformation, for more, for better, for possibility.
Fantastic. We are quite, we're quite light on our time, but I really want to hear more about you. That's the time that I would open for questions and answers. I would open the floor. I really want to hear from you too, but I think our guests, there's so much to contribute. So I would like to continue a little bit more. And as you know, I shared the conversation with you that there is a script, but I'm almost being naughty and coming out of the script a little bit. To go back to the question of imagining, I really liked that all of you brought the question of the imagination as politically productive, important, relevant, and having everything to do with the voice of the youth. We are currently in the middle of a conference trying to imagine what the university is for, and part of that imagination, and I suppose the imagination of the Center for Humanities Research, is also to think with imagination as a powerful tool. And I want to hear from you, how do you engage, how do you think of yourself as a young scholar, a young artist, with imagination, with the political power of imagination. But because I don't want to go too far away from the script, let's also talk about the intergenerational relationship. I mean, you actually introduced that for me. You talk about parents and their children. You talked about Pramesh and the youth, and Leslie Zeitz, and this interaction that happens within the classroom, which is a very powerful place, right? And you know that as an educator as well. So how do you see this intergenerational exchanges, not divides, but exchanges, this contact, and what does it do with our power of imagination? I mean, how can we think carefully about this?
So much. You move from biological parents to intellectual parents.
Yeah.
We're born everywhere. No, I think it's so important that we actually recognize that there's that we are all having the same human experience, from different vantage points. That of course, if someone is 30 years older than you, they come with a particular understanding of how society is going, and they've seen things. And but the big thing that I always found frustrating about intergenerational dialogue or intergenerational imagination is this idea that because someone is either older, they believe that I can, because they, and it comes out of generosity really, that I really don't want you to repeat my mistakes because I've seen how this has gone. This might not go the right way, but a big part of what makes them that wise are those very mistakes, that they were allowed to go through. In fact, they weren't allowed, they forced to make those mistakes independently. And so I think a big part of the tension is that we're constantly trying to write our own stories. And what then happens is that in that process we miss each other. Because I have this firm belief, South Africa has got I don't know if it happens in Ireland, I hope it doesn't. South Africa has got this big problem around, an overemphasis on youth and youth involvement. And by overemphasis, I mean that it's to the detriment of capacity. We hardly speak about the question of capacity. So we say, for instance, in dominant political narrative, they say in the African National Congress, they need to have a young president. They don't say that they need to have a president who is in touch with the reality of the material conditions of South African people. And if they are young, hoo-ha, bonus. They say we need to have a young person. Now you put a young person there, and that young person is completely removed, completely doesn't understand the dynamics. And so I think a big part is that just because we are young does not mean that we are correct. Right? And it does not mean that we are the custodians of this particular future, because someone said something very damning to President Biden in the talk that I went to in the University of Minnesota, courtesy of the CHR. So this person said, you are making policies that you're not going to live long enough to experience, right? And so I felt that, wow, that's, we all thought, wow, this is such a radical statement and striking, but it's also a very unfair statement, right? In the sense that there's a responsibility that, there's a historical consideration of things that allows whoever is the president now to make decisions based on what has happened in the past, and they've got that advantage to be able to make these comparisons. So I think, or these decisions. So I think the intergenerational tension is largely because we miss each other, because we don't want to get to the best idea, we want to be right in the idea at that time. So I think those are the tensions that I find. And something else that I noted around this whole notion, I think there was part of the question around, to reach a stage of reconciliation and justice, and I think the minister mentioned a lot of people, particularly at the University of the Western Cape, young people there, young scholars in the space that I'm in, are particularly, worried about what comes first, justice or reconciliation. Is reconciliation a precondition for justice? Right? Is we can't? Is it contingent upon is justice contingent upon reconciliation? And a big part of the question that I'd like to also open up to my colleagues here is that are we saying that a society that does not reconcile can never be a just society? And I'm not saying yes or no, but I'm saying that that question brings a lot of stakes into the game, particularly of people who lived through apartheid. People who because mind you, people who want to reconcile the most are people who lived through apartheid, who saw what a divided society can be. And it's actually ironically people who did not live in apartheid who do not want to have this conversation about reconciliation. Right? So it's something that I think that it's a conversation that we must have around this, what comes first, reconciliation and justice.
That's really powerful. I just want to bring in this other word, hope, as well. When we talk about imagination, it's very early to bring in hope, but I really resonate with what you just said. I do these creative conversations as a podcast, and as you talked about in the North, Stormont has just, the institutions have been brought back up again, and that's provided a real sense of hope across the north of Ireland. As part of me trying to capture what people think about this, I went to speak to my 97-year-old grandfather, who's in a care home at the moment. And I'm getting tingles in the back of my neck whenever I talk about this, but when his life, the first third of his life, he talked very articulately about feeling like a second-class citizen in his own country and the way he was treated. And yes, there was pain when he was talking about that. The next third of his life was in conflict and really challenging situations, and he can articulate again very eloquently some of the real struggles that he went through as a Catholic living in North Antrim. And then the last third of his life has been in the peace process. And just exactly as you said, the overarching feeling I got from the 1.5 hours that I sat down with him was that we mustn't repeat, if we're talking about these questions of constitutional change in Ireland, we must never repeat what was done to us. And that was, that's exactly as you just said, from someone who's lived through all of that trajectory. I found that really striking. The other thing that gave me hope, the other thing I just wanted to touch on briefly, was marriage equality. Because it's the second time I'll get tingles in the back of my spine, but marriage equality, such a, the first country to vote by referendum for marriage equality is unbelievable. And I am not that young, I will say my age, I'm 42. Thank you. Thank you. So I have grown up in Ireland where I would never have believed this would have been possible. Never. I went to quite a strict Catholic school, and there was such shame attached to sexuality. It was such a, and even now I think in the North, there's still to be around it in the North. But to see how this happened in the Republic was so hopeful, and it was conversations, intergenerational conversations. It was just speaking to family members. It was older people, knowing that their nephew, their grandson, their son, and people being brave to speak about their sexuality was something that was just so powerful in this conversation. And it was family, and it was love. It was literally love that brought this result. But this imagination was created by young people being brave, by being able to take hold of the narrative, and by sharing their stories and their hope and their aspirations. And I think the rest of the country rode on the tails of that and were swept away with that. And again, I think it's a really beautiful illustration of how when intergenerational work can happen, how massive change can happen.
Thank you so much. This is such a great ideas coming through. I want to also piggyback a little bit to this conference we're in, right, about what is the university for a number of reasons. One of them is to, again, also reference Primesh, because when we were speaking at this conference, you know, and he brought up the question or thought about memory, right? Institutional memory of the university. And this is where I'm coming from when I think about intergenerational dialogue, as you called it, right? In that, you know, people remember, people's bodies remember. Right? And so in some ways, you know, the grandfathers that you're talking about are archives, right, of the past, of, you know, our, of what has gone on in our countries. And so that, the kinds of relationships that are formed there are very important. And so, and to think about this, of course, in the university context, we think about mentorship, right? We think about the kind of relationship where, you know, people who've been at the game longer than others, they mentor other people, they mentor younger scholars. And I think that, you know, even the word, it gets such a bad rap, you know, role model. It's a, you know, it's archaic, it's old, nobody wants to, you know, nobody wants to use or be attached to any of that. But perhaps it shouldn't be thrown out with the bathwater. And to say that also, and maybe now moving to much more scholarly thing, or maybe not actually, because I mean, the majority of, there's a whole section of queer scholarship on kind of intergenerational knowledge being passed down from one queer generation to the next, particularly because of the secrecy around what people are doing, who people are with, right? And so there's a long history there about how queer culture, right, what now has become, right, what we term queer culture gets, you know, passed down, has been through these kinds of intergenerational talk. And if you want to read more about that, you could go to a book by David Halperin, literally called How to Be Gay. But I think that the question around intergenerational conversations is difficult in South Africa, particularly because there are also cultural things around age and the kinds of relationships that can be had via age, so which can be productive, but which can also not be productive because of culturally what an older person is supposed to be and how one is supposed to relate to an older person. And I think with the advent of, you know, the Constitution, the post-94 moment, which of course it's great in some aspect, but it, in some aspect has challenged traditional relationships, right? Because of the idea of freedom, of what is possible, what is not possible, what can I as a young person push back against, not push back against, you know, what can you tell me, what can you not tell me? I mean, the hoo-ha that happened about, you know, parents being or not being able to corporally punish their children, right? This is a lot of South Africans are like, you know, who's the parent here, right? I should be able to beat you if I want, right? And so I think, you know, there is a trickiness there around the idea of, I remember once when, you know, you were in Minnesota, I was at Yale at this time, and there was a conference on, with African leaders who were, you know, talking about development of African states. And so, as visiting scholars, we went to this conference, and so a lot of the young African students at the conference would lift their hands and ask some serious, difficult questions about leadership, about corruption, and they would be shut down, right? Like you shouldn't be asking these things. You shouldn't be, that you're being disrespectful. That's actually the language. And so, like, this is just an example of that really complex way in which the old and the young negotiate, as it were. And then the imagination, when I think about post-94, and also we are talking about this thing about the university, what is it for? And we're thinking about, I'm thinking about, because for me the university is post-94. For me the university is, I can only think about it, in that kind of realm. And it is closely tied to the idea of creating a self, right? Trying to find a self, molding a self, right? And you're molding the self with the kinds of foundation that is created by this document, right? That was adopted in 1996. And again, I think that there is an intergenerational thing there, whereas other people's selves are formed before that. And those selves are different by virtue of what is allowed and what is not. Thanks.
Yeah, how are we doing for time? Yeah, so many rich inputs have been shared, so I'm being conscious of not repeating what has been said, because I do agree with a lot. I think I will just share on this issue of dialogue and kind of what I'm doing in this like reimagining conversation. So, this issue of dialogue, I wrote here, dialogue for what and dialogue for whom? Because I think dialogue and having talk shops has become such a popular thing. Like, oh yes, let's have a dialogue on this. And you're like, for what? Why are we having the dialogue? And who's being invited? And I think I would like to even challenge us just today, is what we've had a dialogue, because only 4 or 5 people have spoken. So one of the things that I'm doing through my work is reimagining how we meet and actually have dialogue. And in the forum space, where we're bringing together such different sectors, we're bringing the NGO sector, government, research. These sectors have been working together, inverted commas, for a very long time, but they also have different powers and ranks, right, when you're dealing with particular issues. So in my work, we're dealing with the issue of violence, and who's considered the experts and the person who should sit here at the front and kind of talk about this issue and has all the knowledge is often the researchers or government. And in just how you meet, in shifting just the setup of a dialogue, it has massive impact for the quality of the conversation that you have. So in my workspace, we use the work of Nancy Klein. I'm sure many of us have heard of her. And she speaks of these principles of creating thinking environments, where you need to pay attention to the equality in the room. So the equality of talking time, the equality of different forms of knowledge. Not all of us are academics, not all of us have our thoughts packaged in a particular way. And then how do you hold the space in a way that allows all of those expertise to equally emerge? Then the book that she writes, Time to Think, also speaks about this importance of listening, right? And I think back to the intergenerational, there's so many differences in just how young people and old people listen to each other, if they even listen to each other at all. If we just really going in, most of the older generation are almost like doorstoppers. And they don't, the listening is really a challenge. But the same can be said for, I guess, younger generation who feel, my voice is also not being heard and usually not really listening to where the other part is coming from. So in holding dialogues, how do we have deep listening? Listening that has reserved judgment, right? And then one of my favorites, mostly I follow the work of Brené Brown, who writes on vulnerability, but I think there are plenty of academic works and podcasts around this issue of vulnerability, to really have dialogue that transcends like the mind, that touches the heart, that like activates people to change. Dialogue for what? Okay, we're gonna leave this room and then do what? You need an element of vulnerability. You need people to kind of come down to almost the same level, to connect at a heart-to-heart. And we try and do that in our space through sitting in a circle, through saying people can come dressed as comfortably as possible as you sleep. I don't think I own a decent pair of heels. Because I show up in a way that makes me feel comfortable. And in making people be that vulnerable, it means you come as a person first, and then your mind and intellect is next. And these three components, equality, deep listening, and vulnerability, put in action in dialogue, it's like magic. So I think the challenge is when we talk about dialogue or when we're going to converse, even in our workspaces or as like an intergenerational dialogue, how much attention do we pay to how we meet rather than what we're going to be meeting and talking about?
Thank you for that. And I definitely bring it to this space. I mean, I want to open the conversation, but obviously you are referring to something else. You're referring to an attitude, a gesture towards being able to hold the space in deep vulnerability, in different forms of listening. And I think all of you somehow are talking about perhaps imagination, practice, and freedom in ways in which we can create conditions in the space for this imagination to flourish, for dialogue in this deeper sense to occur. We are still learning, that's for sure. In the institution, as you know, we are still learning. But that's a decision now to, I would say, should we open to the floor and then perhaps have very short questions. I'm looking at Haiti because she will eventually be able to say whether or not we do that. Okay, what I'm going to ask, and I'm really sorry to do that, is that if you could be brief, and if you could just say your name so that the panelists know who you are. But I think we need to pack 3 questions, and then we have the last round before we close, unfortunately, because we could go on, as you know. But, so yes, please, 3 questions. Introduce yourself, please be brief.
I'm surprised you rely on Haiti to keep time.
This thing would be very difficult tomorrow. We would be long. Anyone? Oh, one question.
Hi, my name is Carol O'Neill. I'm from Dublin. Sorry. My name is Carol O'Neill. I'm from Dublin, but I live and work in America. And I want to go back to the idea then, what comes out of this room and after this? What each of you recommend should come out of this? What are the next steps for building a relationship between Ireland and South Africa and imagining and hoping for a better future?
Thank you. This has been incredibly uplifting discussion, and I just want to thank you for that, because present and about people that everyone has spoken to in very moving ways that actually does bring hope, and or at least a sense for me of hopefulness. And I would just be interested in hearing you reflect a little about that kind of obligation to find a way through the present towards an evaporating future, to say some words, because that feels quite real, and not reaching for a kind of an understanding that is not worn out by material conditions, to quote you, in which we live. Yeah.
Thank you very much for all of your talks. It's been really inspiring. I guess I would just like to ask you, if this is a topic of dialogue, what about the question of language? I mean, I'm noticing you're all talking in English. There are obviously very concrete historical reasons why that has happened. I was wondering how language plays into the dialogue and the creation of language, and also the preservation of language and the language of English.
Who would like to give it a go?
I'll start with the last question. Yeah, I think thanks for that question, because I think it also allows us to actually answer some of the questions that we were getting in the brief, with the small time that we have. I think a big part of it is reflecting on, our shared, history or the impact that, British imperialism has had on both of these countries. Is something that is, first of all, not spoken about enough. And I think I'll link it back to the gentleman that asked the first question. Around that, conversation is underrated. There's a lot about, because this is what we're doing here. It's a double-edged sword in the sense that it's another talk shop, or it provokes someone into something. So it could be, it doesn't mean that because it's a double-edged sword you don't use it, or do you use it carefully, right? And so this is part of what I think we have to do, is that we have to continue having these conversations, different spaces, because out of conversation we have some concrete things that we do. And the thing about language, I'll give you an example of basically my life. If I had to articulate myself in my home language of Xhosa, my best friend is in the room here. We both come from King Williamstown. He went to Dale College, then to Rondebosch Boys. I went to Templeton High School. We're both middle class, educated. We went to boys' colleges. If we had to speak in Xhosa to you now, whatever I said, if any of it was interesting, it would never be as interesting in this course, right? So it's a very personal thing as well. This idea that I cannot express myself in the language of my birth as coherently as I can of a language that is visited upon me, right? Now, a big part of that is that is not only my experience in South Africa. It can be an experience of someone in Ireland, someone in Latin America, someone elsewhere in the world. And that speaks to our collective and shared humanity, right? Because our shared humanity is that as human beings, we suffer from the same things in different spatial temporalities, right? And so a big part of the thing around language is that we have not paid sufficient enough attention to the damage that it does to a person who probably in 3 generations' time, my daughter will not be able to, or some people will not be able to speak this language, and because we've let it go now, because for commercial reasons, industrial reasons, I have to be able to speak this particular language, otherwise I do not survive in this society. So language imposed on us becomes a big part of our survival, a big part of us becoming human. Almost to say that in my own language I'm less human. So it's a very interesting thing. I don't have an answer, but I do have a response, and that is my response.
Time is very, very short, unfortunately, so I'm just going to be unfair and ask you to just, if possible, be very, very succinct.
I'll try. Let's just to go to this question about what we take away from this room. It's interesting, in the questions that we had, there was a question about artistic exchange, and we haven't had a chance to do that. And that's no one's fault because of the nature of this, but it is ironic the art is always tacked on at the end, and that's budgets. Artists are always running around scrimping, asking for the droplets from your table, and this happened today. The artist's question we're not able to do. So one of the things I always thought is that in the UK the health budget is about 40%, and the arts budget is about 0.57. I always thought if you switch them, what would it be like? What would that be like? How would, so my takeaway, Minister, I want you to take that back to the Peace Shop as a suggestion from a man from Paraguay. Let's see how that could work out.
Actually, I'm only responsible for the Republic of Ireland.
I mean, the other point about, to your point, I think just this hope thing again, I think is really interesting. In 1997, the reason why I'm in South Africa, I'm writing a play about the influence of South Africa on the Good Friday Agreement, which is a really fascinating story. And one of the things that South Africa provided to us, whenever we hated each other, we couldn't be in the same room. Coming to South Africa, 21 politicians in 1997, was hope. It was hope. South Africa really provided us with hope, and that's a really important. And you can only do what you can do. I'm an artist. I can tell stories, and that's one of the stories that I am really, really passionate about telling and about helping to show how other societies in conflict can also be inspired by hope as well. And the language thing is very painful to me. I'll defy the norms and end on a low. I can't speak my own language at all. I'm from the north. We were allowed to learn it at school. We didn't learn it in secondary school. It's so painful to me that I cannot express myself. It's not that I can't express myself less. I cannot express myself in my own language, and that's hugely, hugely painful.
Okay, so I will respond to the question of what can come out of this. And I think maybe in the closing, the host will speak about maybe what will come out of this. But mine is an invitation, and it's an invitation to deep listening, but also an invitation to be creative. I think most of us have this idea about arts and creativity, and it is that certain people are creative and they're the artists and they will do all of the plays and books. But the reality is almost all of us are born creative. And I think what stands in the way is, I'm stealing from a TED talk by Ethan Loki, and in the TED talk he says, most of us have this, pressure of giving the world something of value. Like it needs to be the gold of this world. And in reality, the world is not like a consistent judge of what is of value. That changes all the time. So we hold ourselves back. We say, I won't sing in the shower, or I won't try this new thing because I don't want to be the fool. So my invitation is, be the fool, be creative. You'll be amazed at the stuff that it unlocks. It's like going back to being a child. And in your reimagining and being playful, like all these other problems that we're facing, solutions will just come. We all gifted and creative in our own ways, and all forms of creativity matter. So be creative.
I would like us to end on that note. I don't have anything to add. I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you, all of you. This has been an incredible conversation. I'm really sorry that we have to be strict about that because I wanted to just go on. But I hope we can continue. And thank you. Maybe would you like to say?
Just to say thank you to the panelists, and this is really a close conversation. It's an open room. And as the chair gains momentum and we send colleagues to both, as the chair gains momentum, and we have a meeting next week actually for the reciprocal piece of the chair. So that we can, send colleagues, intellectuals, academics, and cultural practitioners to Ireland, both share Ireland, and receive additional further scholars this year in particular mean, we're interested in undoing kind of the hard borders of the nation. And this is the goal.
That is the reason why we are again. Thank you, everyone. Stay for the reception. Thank you.
That's the Zeitz motto. Stop.